The Tyraxian Dominion had been playing evolutionary king of the hill for roughly 6 centuries, and they'd gotten disturbingly comfortable with their position at the top of the food chain. Their approach to galactic politics was elegantly straightforward. If your species had evolved superior biological advantages, you deserved to rule the inferior genetic specimens. If you hadn't, well, perhaps you should have tried harder during those crucial millions of years of natural selection. This charmingly social Darwinist philosophy had served them remarkably well across 3 spiral arms. The average Tyraxian stood 12 feet tall in their natural posture, possessed an exoskeleton that could deflect military-grade weaponry, secreted acid capable of dissolving most known metals, and had developed razor-sharp limbs that could slice through starship hull plating. Their circulatory system contained multiple redundant organs. Their nervous system operated on quantum-entangled neural networks, and their reproductive cycle had been optimized through selective breeding programs that would make eugenicists weep with admiration. When the Resource Allocation Summit announced that Earth would be sending a representative to the trade negotiations on deep space platform Meridian 12, the collective reaction throughout the Perseus arm was roughly equivalent to watching a paramecium announce its intention to lecture on advanced physics. Humans, after all, represented the galaxy's most recent biological curiosity. They'd barely managed to stumble beyond their home system, averaged a laughably inadequate 6 feet in height, and had somehow convinced themselves they belonged in interstellar commerce, despite possessing nothing more than fragile skin, inefficient single organs, and an inexplicable tendency to make jokes during serious conversations. No natural armor, no redundant biological systems, no ability to synthesize complex chemicals or interface directly with technology. They were, by every reasonable evolutionary metric, nature's attempt at slapstick comedy. Deep space platform Meridian 12 hung in the gravitational dead zone between 2 red giant stars, providing both excellent strategic positioning and the sort of ominous stellar backdrop that made everyone take resource allocation seriously. The platform itself was a marvel of bioengineering, designed to accommodate 47 different atmospheric compositions, 29 distinct gravitational requirements, and at least 12 incompatible definitions of breathable environment. The Tyraxian section, naturally, was constructed from living coral that could self-repair, and featured furniture that had been bred rather than manufactured. Dr. Amelia Vasquez had drawn the assignment to represent human interests in the Centauri trade corridor negotiations, a posting that had probably caused several insurance actuaries to update their risk assessment algorithms. Not because Amelia was incompetent, quite the opposite, but because she had developed a professional reputation for treating galactic commerce with roughly the same enthusiasm most people reserved for root canal procedures. She was currently absorbed in reviewing commodity futures projections in the platform's Grand Commerce Hall, a sprawling biochamber designed to inspire awe through the judicious application of living architecture and bioluminescent intimidation displays. Amelia had claimed a corner workstation grown from modified fungal networks, spread her documentation across its surface, and was methodically processing the mind-numbing complexities of interstellar shipping tariffs and quantum mineral extraction rights. This scene of dedicated bureaucratic focus was precisely what greeted High Admiral Zorath and his offspring when they arrived for the preliminary negotiations. Zorath represented what happened when you took 6 centuries of genetic optimization and forged them into 12 feet of walking evolutionary perfection. His exoskeleton bore the ritual scarification of campaigns across half the galaxy. His acid glands were calibrated to dissolve 17 different hull compositions, and his compound eyes held the calculating intelligence that came from treating complex economic problems as simple survival of the fittest scenarios. His son, Commander Vexith, represented what happened when you took all that genetic superiority and marinated it in a steady diet of evolutionary propaganda and unquestioned biological supremacy. He possessed all of his father's physical advantages and approximately none of his hard-earned wisdom about the unpredictability of lesser species. Where Zorath moved with the economical precision of an apex predator, Vexith strutted with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered a problem that couldn't be resolved through superior genetics. Progenitor, Vexith announced, his voice carrying the sort of harmonic resonance that suggested his vocal cords had been specifically evolved for intimidation. Is that pathetic specimen supposed to represent the legendary humans? Zorath followed his offspring's gesture toward Amelia's workstation. The human trade negotiator was unremarkably typical by her species standards, possessing brown hair arranged in a practical configuration, unremarkable features that would render her invisible in most crowds, and the sort of focused concentration that suggested she found tariff regulations genuinely fascinating. She wore a standard commercial uniform, carried no visible enhancements, and projected all the biological menace of a particularly dedicated accountant. "So it would appear," Zorath replied, his tone carefully modulated. The High Admiral had survived 6 centuries of galactic politics by learning to gather complete biological data before drawing evolutionary conclusions. His offspring, unfortunately, had developed no such scientific methodology. Vexith's laughter was the sort of sound that made nearby species check their fight-or-flight responses. The mighty humans dispatch a clerk to negotiate with evolutionary perfection. I've encountered more impressive genetic specimens in bacterial cultures. Several nearby commercial delegations suddenly discovered urgent reasons to examine their biochemical compatibility charts, while others began the time-honored tradition of strategically relocating toward emergency atmospheric locks. The crystalline silicate confederation actually started resonating in what their species considered nervous harmonics, creating a sound like breaking glass in a wind tunnel. Amelia, completely absorbed in subsection 93 of rare earth mineral pricing matrices, remained oblivious to the growing biological tension. She'd reached the particularly thrilling section on quantum crystal extraction protocols, which was exactly as stimulating as it sounded. "Perhaps," Vexith continued, his voice escalating to address the broader commercial assembly, "we should evaluate whether this representative possesses sufficient evolutionary development to comprehend the documents she's presumably here to negotiate." This finally penetrated Amelia's economic focus. She glanced up from her projections, took in the towering figure of the Tyraxian commander, and offered the sort of polite professional smile that somehow managed to be more dismissive than any evolutionary insult could have achieved. "I'm sorry," Amelia said, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone accustomed to managing difficult clients. "Were you attempting to communicate with me?" Vexith's acid glands activated involuntarily, a reflexive response that in Tyraxian culture constituted a formal challenge to genetic superiority trials. "I am Commander Vexith of the Tyraxian Dominion, heir to 3 spiral arms of evolutionary perfection, and yes, inferior specimen. I was addressing your inadequate presence." "Wonderful," Amelia replied, already returning her attention to the fascinating world of interstellar trade regulations. "I'm Dr. Amelia Vasquez, Commercial Corps, and I'm attempting to work. Was there something specific you required, or are you simply here for the atmospheric ambience?" The Grand Commerce Hall achieved a silence so complete that even the bioluminescent wall organisms seemed to pause their metabolic processes. Vexith's exoskeleton flushed to a deep crimson, the unmistakable warning sign that his species' famously explosive genetic pride was approaching critical threshold. "You dare demonstrate such casual disrespect in my progenitor's presence?" Amelia looked up again, this time wearing the expression of someone who just realized they were being asked to participate in amateur evolutionary theater. "Listen, Commander, I'm sure you're absolutely terrifying back home, but I've got approximately 10 hours of commodity specifications to process before tomorrow's session. If you're looking to establish biological dominance hierarchies, I'm sure there's a genetics laboratory somewhere on the platform." The sound Vexith produced was somewhere between a roar of evolutionary outrage and the hissing of pressurized chemical systems. "You genetically inferior weakling, you wouldn't survive 30 seconds in actual biological competition." "Almost certainly not," Amelia agreed with cheerful scientific honesty. "Fortunately, I'm here to negotiate rare earth mineral quotas, not audition for your natural selection demonstration program." This represented the precise moment when Vexith committed his first, and ultimately most consequential, evolutionary error. He reached across Amelia's workstation and deliberately dissolved her carefully organized documentation with a precise application of acid secretion. The transformation in Amelia was subtle but unmistakable. Her casual posture straightened with academic precision, her eyes focused with the sort of attention that suggested she was suddenly treating this as a scientific hypothesis worth testing, and her voice dropped to a tone that prompted several nearby delegates to reach for their emergency atmospheric masks. "That," Amelia said with scientific detachment, "was a fascinating behavioral demonstration." Vexith laughed, producing a sound like grinding exoskeletons and chemical reactions. What possible response could you generate, human? File a formal biological complaint? Actually, Amelia said, standing and methodically straightening her uniform with laboratory precision, I was considering something considerably more empirical. Your people value genetic superiority, correct? Evolutionary fitness? The ability to overcome challenges through biological advantages? Obviously. Vexith sneered. Unlike your species, we understand that genetic perfection determines commercial authority. Excellent, Amelia replied. Then you'll have no objection to demonstrating that hypothesis scientifically. I formally challenge you to an evolution trial, conducted according to traditional Tyraxian biological protocols. The Grand Commerce Hall erupted into biochemical chaos. Emergency communications flew between species representatives. Xenobiological experts were frantically consulted, and what sounded suspiciously like genetic betting pools began forming in several corners of the chamber. High Admiral Zorath stepped forward, his compound eyes reflecting careful calculation. Human, he said with measured deliberation, you may not fully comprehend the biological implications of what you're proposing. A Tyraxian evolution trial involves survival competition with one of our apex bioweapons, followed by direct genetic combat between the participants. It is a test that has eliminated genetically superior specimens. Amelia nodded thoughtfully. And if I demonstrate superior evolutionary fitness, you won't, Vexith snapped with obvious biological satisfaction. But if by some impossible genetic fluke you survive, you'll have earned the right to speak as an equal among evolved beings. And if my genetic line proves inferior, you'll be dead, Vexith said with undisguised evolutionary pleasure. But at least you'll die like a properly tested specimen, instead of living like an unexamined genetic accident. Amelia considered this proposition for several moments, then shrugged with scientific indifference. Seems like a reasonable experimental design. When do we commence the trial? The following 24 hours represented a masterclass in xenobiological crisis management. An emergency communications ricocheted between species genetic databases, evolutionary precedent specialists were hastily summoned, and insurance geneticists worked overtime calculating survival probability assessments. The prevailing scientific consensus suggested that the human trade negotiator had either experienced a complete psychological breakdown or was operating under some form of exotic genetic delusion. The trial was scheduled for the following morning in the platform's central bio-arena, a facility originally designed for evolutionary exhibitions but regularly repurposed for exactly this sort of commercial emergency. The Tyraxian had insisted on their traditional format. Both participants would first face a Hellspine Reaper, a delightful creature that represented the evolutionary result of crossing a molecular disruptor with a hive mind and then optimizing it for maximum lethality through 6 generations of selective breeding. Amelia spent the evening methodically reviewing Hellspine Reaper biological specifications, approaching the task with the same systematic attention she'd applied to mineral extraction documentation. Various commercial colleagues visited to offer their condolences, assistance with final genetic samples, and contact information for next-of-kin notification services. You realize, said Trade Coordinator Zylf of the Methane Collective, his gaseous form rippling with obvious distress, there's no commercial shame in withdrawing from this biological challenge. The Tyraxian respect strategic genetic retreat when facing impossible evolutionary odds. I appreciate the concern, Amelia replied without looking up from her xenobiological research materials. But I believe I'll follow through with this scientific experiment. Amelia, Zylf persisted, his molecular structure fluctuating with anxiety. You're about to face a creature specifically engineered to eliminate evolved life forms. Vexith has been genetically optimized for this his entire existence. What conceivable evolutionary advantage could you possibly possess? Amelia finally looked up, offering the same polite professional smile that had initiated this entire biological situation. Adaptability, mostly. The morning of the trial found the central bio-arena packed with representatives from every species currently stationed on Meridian 12. Word had propagated rapidly through the commercial community, and the general consensus suggested they were about to witness either the most spectacular upset in recorded evolutionary history or the most expensive genetic experiment ever committed in the name of interstellar trade relations. Vexith entered the bio-arena to thunderous biochemical approval from the Tyraxian delegation, his exoskeleton gleaming under the specialized lighting, his acid glands primed for optimal secretion rates, his razor limbs honed to molecular sharpness. He wore ceremonial genetic enhancement armor, carried traditional bioweapons forged from his ancestors' genetic material, and moved with the confident stride of someone who'd never questioned his own evolutionary superiority. Amelia entered to polite, distinctly nervous biochemical reactions, and what sounded like several species offering prayers to their respective evolutionary processes. She wore standard commercial attire, carried what appeared to be a scientific field kit, and looked like she was preparing to attend a research symposium rather than engage in biological combat. The Hellspine Reaper was released from its containment facility with appropriate evolutionary fanfare. It emerged writhing and calculating, its biomechanical systems gleaming under the lights, its predatory intelligence scanning for optimal genetic targets. The creature stood 10 feet in multiple dimensions simultaneously, weighed approximately as much as a small research station, and possessed the sort of focused, intelligent malevolence that viewed everything in the universe as either genetic material or obstacles to genetic material. Vexith raised his ancestral bioweapons and charged with a war cry that probably violated several atmospheric composition treaties. The Hellspine Reaper, delighted to encounter something that wanted to engage in recreational genetic combat, flowed forward to meet him. What followed represented a spectacular demonstration of why the Tyraxian had achieved evolutionary dominance across 3 spiral arms. Vexith fought with the fluid grace of a perfectly evolved predator, his bioweapons finding vulnerable points in the creature's defenses, his acid secretions allowing multiple simultaneous attacks, and his exoskeleton enabling him to grapple with something that could have been employed as a biological weapons platform. The assembled audience generated appropriate biochemical appreciation as Vexith systematically dismantled the creature's offensive capabilities, providing a masterclass in evolutionary combat that demonstrated exactly why his species had achieved genetic supremacy through the simple expedient of being biologically superior to everyone else. The Hellspine Reaper finally collapsed, its biosystems overwhelmed by Vexith's relentless genetic assault. The commander stood triumphant over his fallen specimen, razor limbs raised in victory, his evolutionary cry echoing through the bio-arena like the sound of species ascending to genetic perfection. Then Amelia's turn arrived. The human trade negotiator walked calmly to the bio-arena center, field kit in hand, and studied the second Hellspine Reaper as it was released. This specimen was noticeably larger than the first, its biomechanical systems scarred from previous evolutionary encounters, its predatory intelligence holding the sort of calculating malevolence that came from surviving multiple genetic competitions. Amelia stood perfectly motionless as the creature approached, her expression thoughtful, like someone trying to recall whether they'd remembered to calibrate their scientific instruments. The Hellspine Reaper paused, confused by the absence of threatening biological displays or evolutionary posturing. In its considerable experience, things that entered bio-arenas either fled in genetic terror or attempted to cause biological harm. This small, soft specimen was doing neither. The audience held its collective biochemical breath. Amelia opened her field kit and withdrew what appeared to be a small cylindrical device. She examined it briefly, made a minor adjustment to its molecular settings, and then casually deployed it toward the approaching Hellspine Reaper. The device attached itself to the creature's biomechanical systems with a soft electromagnetic click. Amelia withdrew a second device, this one resembling a standard scientific scanner, and activated a clearly marked function. The electromagnetic pulse wasn't particularly large by military standards, but it was precisely calibrated and perfectly timed. The Hellspine Reaper staggered, more surprised than damaged, its biomechanical systems having absorbed most of the disruption. But the pulse had achieved its intended purpose. It now had the creature's complete and undivided attention. Amelia began walking backward with measured, deliberate steps, her eyes never leaving the increasingly annoyed specimen. The Hellspine Reaper, now thoroughly irritated by this unprecedented treatment, began building toward an attack. This was precisely when Amelia demonstrated the first fundamental principle of human evolutionary strategy. When facing a biologically superior opponent, change the basic parameters of natural selection. Instead of meeting the creature's assault directly, Amelia waited until the last possible moment before stepping aside with economical precision. The Hellspine Reaper, fully committed to its biological attack, flowed into the bio-arena wall with sufficient force to register on evolutionary monitors. While the creature was recovering from its unexpected encounter with immovable architecture, Amelia produced a third device resembling a small atmospheric processor. She activated it near the beast's sensory apparatus, and the device released a cloud of precisely formulated pheromones that triggered the creature's hibernation response. The Hellspine Reaper suddenly found itself biochemically convinced that winter was approaching, and it needed to enter a 6-month dormancy cycle immediately. It curled into a defensive ball and began shutting down its non-essential biological systems. Amelia walked calmly around to the creature's dormant form, produced a fourth device that looked suspiciously like a veterinary scanner, and confirmed that the specimen had entered complete biological stasis. The bio-arena achieved a silence so profound that it seemed to affect local space-time. Amelia straightened her commercial uniform, walked back to the arena center, and looked up at the thousands of shocked biochemical systems surrounding her. "I should probably mention," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the absolute quiet, "that I spent 20 years as a xenobiological researcher with the Terran Colonial Science Corps before transitioning to commercial negotiations. We have a fundamental research principle: observe, hypothesize, test, and adapt. Also, never enter any biological system without understanding its basic operating parameters." Vexith stared at her, his exoskeleton trembling with barely controlled evolutionary rage. "You cheated. You employed artificial technology." "I employed scientific methodology," Amelia corrected with academic precision. "There's a significant difference. Your people value genetic advantages, but my people value intellectual adaptation. We learned long ago that the most successful organism is simply the one that solves problems most effectively. This is not how honorable evolutionary competition is properly conducted," Vexith shouted, his voice cracking with biochemical indignation. Amelia's expression remained perfectly professional, but something in her eyes grew measurably more analytical. "Commander, allow me to explain something fundamental about human evolutionary philosophy. We don't compete for genetic superiority, biological dominance, or evolutionary purity. We compete to survive, to adapt, and to protect the systems we've developed. Evolution is a process, not a destination, and intelligence is just another biological tool." Vexith deployed his ancestral bioweapons, his exoskeleton flushed deep crimson with uncontrollable genetic rage. "Then let us discover how your intellectual adaptation serves you in direct biological combat." "I'd really prefer not to," Amelia said quietly, her voice carrying an undertone that made several species in the audience begin backing toward atmospheric exits. "You've already clearly demonstrated that you're stronger, faster, better armed, and more experienced in genetic combat than I am. If we engage biologically, one of us is definitely going to experience significant evolutionary pressure, and it might not be me." The threat was delivered with such casual scientific detachment that it took several seconds for the complete biological implications to register throughout the bio-arena. When they did, a collective shiver of evolutionary recognition ran through the assembled commercial representatives. But Vexith was far beyond rational genetic analysis. With a roar that seemed to shake the platform's biostructural foundations, he charged across the arena. Amelia didn't move until the Tyraxian commander was almost upon her, then stepped aside with minimal effort while simultaneously deploying something small that adhered to his exoskeleton as he thundered past. Vexith's charge carried him several more steps before he could stop and wheel around to face her. He looked down at his chest plate, where a small device now interfaced with his biological systems. "What is?" he began. Amelia activated another function on her scientific scanner. The bio-neural disruptor was a piece of technology that most civilized species considered a violation of evolutionary ethics. It caused no permanent genetic damage, but it temporarily interfered with the victim's biological control systems, making coordinated movement impossible, while leaving them fully conscious and completely aware of their biochemical helplessness. Vexith collapsed as his own exoskeleton betrayed him, his limbs refusing to obey his commands, his voice reduced to incoherent biochemical sounds. He could see, hear, and think with perfect clarity, but he couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything except lie helpless on the bio-arena floor while his mind processed the full magnitude of his evolutionary miscalculation. Amelia walked over and knelt beside the paralyzed commander, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the arena through the facility's acoustic biosystems. "Commander Vexith," she said with the tone of someone delivering a scientific conclusion, "you've made several critical errors in your biological hypothesis. You assumed that because humans appear genetically inferior, we are actually inferior. You assumed that because we prefer intellectual solutions, we're incapable of effective biological responses. You assume that because we're relatively new to galactic commerce, we don't understand the established evolutionary rules. She paused, her eyes meeting his terrified gaze with clinical detachment. Allow me to correct those assumptions through empirical evidence. Humans aren't genetically inferior. We're developmentally efficient. We don't avoid biological conflict because we fear it. We avoid it because we understand its long-term consequences and prefer more sustainable solutions. We don't misunderstand evolutionary rules. We simply operate by different, more adaptive parameters. Amelia stood and directed her attention toward High Admiral Zorath, who had been observing the entire exchange with growing biochemical alarm and what might have been the beginning of genuine scientific respect. "High Admiral," Amelia said, her voice returning to normal commercial tones, "your offspring challenged me to an evolution trial. According to Tyraxian biological protocols, I believe this means he has been definitively outcompeted." Zorath nodded slowly, his compound eyes reflecting rapid evolutionary calculations. "The trial is concluded. You have demonstrated superior adaptive fitness." "Actually," Amelia said, "I've demonstrated superior problem-solving methodology. The distinction is important, and it's one that your species might want to consider in future commercial interactions." She walked back to the Bio-Arena Center and addressed the assembled representatives of 47 different species. "Distinguished colleagues, honored delegates, and esteemed representatives of various evolutionary lineages, I want to make something absolutely clear about humanity's position in galactic commerce. We joined the interstellar community because we genuinely believe in cooperation, mutual benefit, peaceful conflict resolution, and the tremendous advantages of intellectual collaboration over biological competition." Her voice developed a harder edge that made several species unconsciously activate their defensive biological systems. "However, we are neither scientifically naive nor evolutionarily defenseless. Humanity has been engaged in adaptive competition for millions of years of evolutionary history, and we have become exceptionally, professionally effective at it. We have developed technologies capable of disrupting entire ecosystems, methodologies that can analyze and counter any biological system, and adaptive strategies that can transform any environment into a survivable habitat. We choose not to employ these capabilities because we believe there are more constructive approaches for resolving our differences." She looked directly at Zorath with the expression of someone delivering important research data. "But if anyone chooses to mistake our preference for intellectual solutions as evidence of evolutionary weakness or biological incapability, they are welcome to test that scientific hypothesis. I should warn you, however, that such experiments generally conclude poorly for the specimens conducting them." The bio-neural disruptor's effects were beginning to dissipate, and Vexith was starting to regain minimal control over his biological systems. Amelia walked over and professionally assisted him to his feet, her manner courteous and completely businesslike. "Commander," she said, "I hope there are no lingering biochemical resentments about this morning's scientific demonstration. You fought with considerable genetic skill and evolutionary bravery, and under different experimental conditions, you would very likely have achieved biological victory. But these weren't different conditions, and this is what actually happened." Vexith stared at her, his compound eyes cycling through rage, confusion, humiliation, and something that might have been the embryonic beginning of scientific curiosity. "I don't understand," he said finally, his voice hoarse from the bio-neural disruption. "You could have eliminated my genetic line easily. Why didn't you?" Amelia smiled, and for the first time since entering the bio-arena, it reached her eyes and seemed genuinely warm. "Because that would have been wasteful and scientifically counterproductive. You're young, you're genetically impressive, and you're clearly intelligent. Give yourself a few decades of actual research experience, and you might even develop into genuine wisdom. The galaxy needs leaders who understand that evolutionary success isn't just about what biological systems you can eliminate, but about what cooperative relationships you can build and sustain." She turned and began walking toward the bio-arena exit, then paused and looked back over her shoulder. "Besides," she added with obvious relief, "I still have those rare earth mineral quotas to negotiate. And after this morning's biological excitement, I suspect everyone's going to be much more reasonable about the technical specifications and commercial frameworks." The trade negotiations that followed were universally acknowledged as the most productive and efficiently conducted in the sector's recorded commercial history. The Centauri trade corridor agreements were finalized in unprecedented time, with remarkably equitable terms for all participating species. Several civilizations made significant concessions they had previously refused to even consider, and the general atmosphere throughout the proceedings was one of mutual respect, careful courtesy, and what might charitably be described as healthy scientific caution. Amelia returned to her commodity projections with obvious satisfaction, treating the entire bio-arena incident as a minor interruption to her actual commercial responsibilities. She never mentioned the evolution trial in her official trade reports, referring to it only as cross-species biological research activities and mutual scientific understanding initiatives in her bureaucratic summary. But word of the confrontation spread rapidly throughout the galactic commercial community. Within standard trade cycles, every major species in the Perseus arm had heard some version of the story about the human trade negotiator who had faced down a Tyraxian commander and emerged evolutionarily victorious. The specific biological details varied considerably depending on who was recounting the tale, but the core scientific message remained consistent. Humanity was not to be casually underestimated or carelessly challenged. The Tyraxian Dominion, for its part, quickly and quietly revised its official assessment of human evolutionary capabilities. High Admiral Zorath personally recommended that all future commercial interactions with Earth's representatives be conducted with appropriate scientific respect and comprehensive biological caution. He also arranged for his offspring to spend several years studying human technological development, adaptive methodologies, and evolutionary theory, an educational program that Vexith approached with considerably more intellectual humility than he had demonstrated in the bio-arena. Dr. Amelia Vasquez continued her distinguished career with the commercial corps, earning a galaxy-wide reputation as one of the most effective and results-oriented trade negotiators in the service. She never again found it necessary to resort to biological demonstrations of human capabilities, but she never needed to. Her scientific reputation preceded her, and her commercial partners invariably found themselves wondering exactly what other adaptive surprises humanity might have quietly developed during their rapid transition from planetary to interstellar civilization. The galaxy had absorbed an important evolutionary lesson. When a species managed to claw its way from a single world to interstellar commerce in less than 3 centuries, it was probably prudent to assume they had learned something valuable about surviving in hostile environments, adapting to impossible challenges, and overcoming seemingly insurmountable biological odds through the aggressive application of intelligence. And Dr. Amelia Vasquez, sitting in her office processing the latest batch of commodity futures and trade protocols, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile as she reflected on the fundamental irony of the situation. The Tyraxian had spent 6 centuries building their reputation on genetic superiority and evolutionary dominance, only to discover that the most dangerous competitors were often the ones who looked like they'd rather be analyzing spreadsheets than engaging in biological warfare. After all, anyone could evolve superior physical capabilities given sufficient geological time. It took genuine intelligence to recognize that evolution never stops, and real wisdom to understand that the most successful adaptation might be learning when not to compete at all.